he could probably save the hostages. Accordingly, he told Stuart not to entertain any counter-proposal, but to give a signal the very moment the insurgents rejected his demand. On that signal, a storming party was to batter in the door and attack the insurgents with the bayonet. No shots were to be fired, lest some of the hostages be hit. Who were to form the storming party? Lee felt that, as the insurrection was apparently directed against state authority, the militia, if they desired to do so, should have the honor of capturing the invaders. About 6:30, therefore, he asked Colonel Shriver, head of the Maryland Volunteers in Harpers Ferry, whether his men wanted to deliver the assaults. Shriver immediately declined. His soldiers, he said, had only come to help the people of Harpers Ferry. "These men of mine," he went on, "have wives and children at home. I will not expose them to such risks. You are paid for doing this kind of work." Lee then inquired of Colonel Robert W. Baylor, senior officer of the Virginia militia companies, whether he wished to organize the forlorn hope. Baylor also declined. Lee thereupon turned to Lieutenant Greene of the Marines to know if he wished the honor of taking those men out. Greene doffed his hat and warmly thanked Lee, who thereupon told him to pick 12 men from his detachment as a storming party. Greene immediately did so and selected a dozen others as a reserve. 3 were told off to break in the doors of the engine house with hammers, and all of them were instructed personally by Lee to employ only the bayonet. He explained to them also how to distinguish the captured civilians, and he ordered them not to injure the slaves in the building, unless the Negroes offered resistance. This last order was prompted by lack of knowledge whether the Negroes were in the conspiracy. It was 7 o'clock on the morning of October 18 when arrangements were complete, and the light was sufficient for the assault to be made. In civilian clothes still, and unarmed, Lee took his stand on a slight elevation about 40 feet from the doors of the engine house. Stuart was ready with his flag of truce. He and Greene had agreed that a wave of Stuart's hat was to be the signal that the insurrectionists rejected the terms. Greene and his selected 24 men were close by but out of the line of fire, which had virtually ceased during the night. The militia were in position, surrounding the building at a little distance. The whole population of the town and most of the countryside had gathered to witness the assault. Fully 2,000 people were looking on when Stuart advanced with his flag to the entrance of the engine house. In answer to his summons, a gaunt, begrimed old man opened one of the doors about 4 inches and thrust out a carbine. Stuart, who had been on duty in Kansas, immediately confirmed the identification of this man. He was none other than Osawatomie John Brown. Stuart read Lee's terms, which Brown at once began to argue. He wanted assurance that he would be permitted to leave the town with his prisoners and his wagon. He must be free to cross the bridge into Maryland, and to go along the road by the canal to a certain point. Then he would liberate his captives. Almost before Stuart could announce that Lee would entertain no counter-proposal, Brown was advancing another compromise. The hostages in the engine house overheard all this, of course, and some of them began to importune Stuart to call to Colonel Lee and see if he would not modify the terms set forth in the note. One voice from within cried out in a very different tone, "Never mind us. Fire!" The speaker was Lewis W. Washington, grandnephew of the general. Lee, who knew him well, recognized his inflections and remarked quietly, "The old revolutionary blood does tell." Stuart continued, trying to explain that Lee would not consider any other terms. Brown babbled on. The hostages kept up their appeal. It was a long parley. Finally, Stuart broke away, stepped from in front of the house, and waved his hat. On the second, 3 of Greene's Marines advanced with their sledgehammers and tried to batter down the doors with them. The defenders opened fire almost as soon. In a moment it became evident that the doors were secured in such a way that they would spring inward under every blow. Greene ordered the men to drop the hammers and move away. Looking about him, he saw a long ladder lying on the ground nearby, and he told some of his men to pick this up and use it instead of the sledges. Major Russell, with nothing in his hand but a rattan switch, advanced with these marines to the doors. One thrust of the improvised battering ram was futile. At the next, a ragged hole was splintered in one door. Lieutenant Green came from the abutment where he had been directing the attack, and crept through the hole armed only with his light dress sword. Russell followed him. The next man, a Marine private, was shot down, mortally wounded. The fourth was struck in the face by a bullet. A few seconds more, and the detachment was all inside. 3 minutes after Stuart had given his signal, the affair was over. There were 4 dead men on the floor, 2 of whom had been killed prior to the assault that morning. One man was dying from an earlier bullet. Brown himself was bleeding from wounds inflicted by Lieutenant Green's sword, and was thought to be mortally wounded. 2 others were uninjured. The hostages, 13 in number, were dirty and half famished, but all of them had escaped bullets and bayonets. Colonel Lewis Washington refused to come out until a pair of gloves were brought, so that his neighbors might not see his soiled hands. The dead and the wounded were carried from the building and were laid on the grass.